proven techniques, application portfolio management. And today we have our guest speaker from Oracle, and I'd like to introduce Jason Williamson. And Jason, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Jason Williamson, and I am in the Oracle's development organization taking care of platform and legacy migration. So the topic of application portfolio management is really important to us, as we'll talk about going forward. So thanks, Raghu. I'll kick it back to you, and you can tee it up, and we can go from there.
All right. Thanks, Jason. And my name is Raghu Kodali, and I'm part of Solix Technologies and doing product management and strategy for Solix product line. So today in this session, Jason and myself will talk about the application portfolio management and some of the best practices and techniques that we have been seeing used at different enterprises, and what we have also been learning from customers as we go by. So Jason, I'll pass the control back to you, and you can walk us through the initial, set the baseline and give us some understanding of the application portfolio management and the importance of the legacy, what does legacy application actually mean, and so forth.
Wonderful. All right, let's see if I can, right. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and pass that back to you, so you can just go ahead and advance the slides for me. For some reason it's not wanting to respond, so I'll just go ahead and throw that back, and we can move into the agenda.
Okay.
So, yeah. Thanks. You can be Vanna for us today. So just, again, what we'll cover on a high level is this idea of kind of application portfolio management. Why is it becoming more and more important for the organization, and to the point where Gartner's talking about it, other analysts are talking about it, and how does that play into the practical management of your day-to-day life? We'll talk about how that integrates in with legacy systems and managing those legacy systems, which plays into the entire portfolio management strategy, whether you're modernizing them or just moving forward status quo. And then how does that legacy system interact? How do we manage that? And then getting into more practical application of an APM strategy. So we'll look at what APM is from a high level, and we'll look at how do you take what you've learned from application portfolio management and enact that in the everyday world. So from a perspective of the business climate, we often talk about change and business transformation and things like that, right? And it's true. We all have these on our slides. We all talk about this, but the fact is that the business climate is changing. Technology is changing, and a lot of things are impacting our applications. So one thing that I thought was an interesting study by Forrester, when they asked CEOs, they said, what percentage of your IT department is an enabler of innovation? So in other words, does your IT enable innovation, or do they inhibit? 90% of the respondents, this is in 2008, I believe, said that IT inhibited innovation, which is just backwards, right? Because innovation is something that IT is supposed to do, and reducing cost, that's another focus now in business transformation, especially given the technology climate. Another interesting statistic from Forrester was that 80 to 85% of IT budgets are what we would at Oracle call lights on, right? Just maintenance. So what we're trying to do is figure out a way to take our portfolio, rationalize it, understand where there are efficiencies, and turn that kind of pyramid of technology costs upside down, right? So the last couple things is, pace of business and obviously transparency, getting a better visualization, reporting, and kind of a 360 view of the world. That quote at the bottom there of Gartner, in a time of accelerating turbulence, the valuation of a company is strongly be affected by how it's able to change. And, the larger our IT infrastructure, the more difficult that is. And so we'll talk about how we can solve some of those problems. I think the biggest effect is what we'll see on the next slide is from the survey, not just enabling innovation, but how can we improve our business processes across the entire organization. So you can see the CIO survey there at the bottom. Integrating and enhancing is number one priority. We have whether you're public sector, you have a larger constituency to serve with a smaller amount of budget, or you're a commercial company where you're trying to serve more with less money, it all will come down to looking at the business processes and what resources do I have to evaluate those. And you really can't do that unless you kind of deal with this issue of legacy and legacy systems. So often at Oracle, before we discuss migration to our platform, of course, is we'll have this discussion of what is legacy, right? And in our next slide, that's what we'll talk about. So legacy systems means different things to different people. It could be, COBOL on DB2 mainframe. It could be one thing that I'm seeing and growing in flux is Sybase. Given the situation in the marketplace, it could be pre-relational data. It could be AS400 on DB2. It could be flat file. Legacy software is things that reduce agility. It inhibits your competitiveness. It doesn't allow you to address being nimble in an emerging market. So it's that brittle technology. It's that software that's been coded over years and years and years and years, where when it runs, it's doing your business process, but it's just hard to change. And can Java be a legacy application? Absolutely. We've been doing Java applications now for years, and so now they are facing this issue of becoming a legacy system. And the data that's underneath of that is also getting more difficult to integrate with and more difficult to archive and access at a later date when we move onward and forward. The other interesting point about legacy systems is another characteristic is something that increases your risk. It could be a technical risk, like it's an unsupported platform. It could be an outage. It could be even just the other day I was with a government customer where they were talking about a particular legacy platform that they have running core systems and mentioning, wow, we can't even find these parts on eBay anymore. So it is a reality. I think a third thing in risk assessment is the skill sets. It's a growing amount of people that are learning open systems, but whether it's language or standards-based data access, right? So there's less people in COBOL, there's less people doing things like Power Builder, less people doing things like RPG. So it's a continued issue. Obviously, cost is a characteristic of a legacy platform. We're seeing now that you can run a legacy mainframe on open systems and not change the business logic at a greatly reduced cost. That's just an example. Maybe we could take advantage of storage compression in Oracle and run much more efficiently on less storage and less hardware. We still need to be able to have access to that and get to that point, and we'll address how we do that later on. But it's an issue of cost now. Accenture quoted here at the bottom is I find quite interesting, is that it's a government statistic, but it's applicable across the board. Just a big percentage of the workforce is facing retirement in the next few years. This quote is a few years old now. It's 10 years, but we're pushing on that now. And when you talk about business processes and business logic and how the IT infrastructure is working, that's often in the heads of our developers and our business process people, the people that are retiring. So there's an impending, when you talk to Gartner, when you talk to Forrester, you see this impending HR crisis that we're having with the knowledge transfer. And the reason why is it's a challenging environment. So, if you look at our next slide here, you'll see a very typical infrastructure, a typical place. And, you'll see mainframe, you'll see CA products, Rack App, COBOL, you'll see Java, you'll see the good old green screen. And so the challenges are, how application retirement, that's a big one. I've got an application that I need to retire or I need to sunset. I got to turn it off because I've got something else. But you know what? I've got the data that legally I'm required to go after. How do I get that? How do I get that in the new system? That's a big challenge. Data redundancy is a big challenge. I frequently talk to people who are in a merger or they're in a situation where they're bringing different reporting systems together, and there's tons of redundancy. The single source of truth is just not there anymore. And then, of course, aging resources and inflexible systems. Those are obvious, right? And so that's all centered around increasing cost and business risk, right? So moving on, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with our portfolio? What can we do, right? And that enters in this discipline, this topic of application portfolio management. You know, if you talk to Gartner about legacy modernization, if you talk to Gartner about that, you'll see them do their Magic Quadrant with tools and things and products in this space, this APM space. And so it's still a very young space. It's still, you know, largely done manually, largely done through services, largely done through spreadsheets. So what we want to talk about is how can we kind of do a little bit of a quantum leap there and get through this process so that we can start seeing some value. So the application portfolio management process really involves several steps, right? It starts with identifying your application. Seems like it's very obvious stuff, right? Identifying your application, collecting the data. It also means that we would decompose, and we'll talk about the difference between kind of a macro view versus a micro view in just a moment, how we can fit those things in, right? And then we look at analyzing that. So once we have that, we have it collected in a repository, not like a spreadsheet, but actual repository. We can analyze this, look for complexity, look for redundancy, look for even, you know, down to dead code. Where is data getting transferred from one system to another, following the money, as it were, right? And then the last part, the last stage, is kind of the implementation. It's what do I do now? Rationalize. Do I rationalize my portfolio? Well, obviously you rationalize that, but when I rationalize it, what do I do? Do I archive it? Do I go into an active archive or a passive archive? What do those things even mean? Do I retire my application? Do I want to modernize this application and move to a couple different ways, right? And so that's kind of where we are in the APM process. So when you think about implementing an APM strategy, you need to think in terms of this circle, right? You have to identify, you have to collect, you have to decompose, you have to analyze. Once you have that repository built up, right, then you can move on, right? In our next slide, you know, we look at kind of what value cycle is for application portfolio management. Based on how long
Hey, Jason, is still there?
Yes.
The connection has been broken. Right. So we'll just hold on for like 10-15 seconds to get Jason back on the line. So if you all can please mute yourself and get Jason back on the line in a few seconds. So I think Jason is going to join us in a minute or so, but in the interest of time, I keep continuing. So, hey Jason, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. We're having a little construction, so I'm going to switch to cell. Hopefully that will be better. I apologize for that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so this is, you know, the traditional grid that you can see with respect to the decisions that need to be made. When you have your analysis, what kinds of things do you do in it? Do you keep it? You know, I like that tolerate, right? Do you innovate and invest in it? Do you want to move it forward? Do you kill it? Or do you re-engineer and modify that? And so this is kind of what you want to consider and have an idea of, is it going to be expensive? Is it going to take long? Are the costs high? Are the risks high? So these are all decisions that you need to make, that you will be faced with once you go through and see what you have in your portfolio. If we move on to the next slide, from a modernization approach, this takes it down to a little bit more bullet point on what I physically can do with these things. How do I enable? Do I want to keep this on the mainframe? Do I want to keep this on the legacy platform and just do integration and reuse? Do I want to rehost this? For example, I can take legacy COBOL running on a mainframe CICS environment and run it under Oracle, Tuxedo as is, and then do a database migration. So there's a little Oracle plug for you. COTS replacement, obviously, is replacing things with packages. We do see folks doing automated and re-architecture, which is where we do an actual code migration from one to another. Automated migration versus re-architecture is just the level of tooling that's involved. And then all of them typically have some form of application retirement in place. And so the question is what do I do with that once I retire the application? Because there's something I have to do with the data. I might need it actively in my re-architected system or my cost application. I might need to have it real time. I might need to be okay to get it later. So that's a part of our question, the decisions on how we're going to be able to move forward. I think the key here, though, is all begins with an APM strategy. You have to have a portfolio and rationalize it, because you cannot modernize what you do not know. And never surprise me that you'll go in and you'll say, someone's going to say, what's the code? And, well, it's this, and this. We'll go through and analyze the code and variably identify applications that are maybe unreachable that they thought were, or processes that are executed that weren't. If you stick 5 users in the room and ask them how the business process is, you're going to get 7 answers. So you need to rationalize what the IT infrastructure is really doing, and that's the application portfolio management strategy is going to do for you. So if we move on to the next slide, at Oracle, we've broken these down in kind of 2 different categories. One would be a macro level view, and the other would be a micro. And it's exactly what you would assume. Macro is typically where you start. What are the applications? What are they called? How expensive are they? How big are they? What do they cost to? Things like that. It's a very service-oriented, typically driven, and you categorize these at a high level. So you can see this is where you get your nice, Visio charts. When we get down into a micro level, we actually can expose code-level logic. It's dynamic. So if code is changed, you reparse the code. It's very tool-driven. So it's automatically done. There's several vendors out there that will create tools to do that. And what you get is a repository of information where you can literally identify variables and how they're calculated to data and how it's passed from one program to another, one system to another, one module to another. This is where you now are armed with what can you do for information lifecycle management, right? At Oracle, we have the ability to do some lifecycle management from Oracle to Oracle. What we have holes is what do we do with non-Oracle data sources to Oracle? How do I do active archiving? What about data transformation and long-term storage? How do I deal with passive archiving versus active, right? And this tends to be the advanced folks, and I don't want to steal. It's not what I do, but it's not. If you do it right, it's not services driven, right? It's tool driven. The discovery, the archiving, the processing, the accessing, right? And so we'll talk about that in a moment. But let me move into a real world case study where it was very important to understand kind of the benefits and what we learned specifically around this in the state of North Carolina. So in the state of North Carolina, they have 1,500 apps throughout the entire state, legacy systems ranging from COBOL, DB2, VB, everything, right? Even OpenCMS. Some of the critical issues were cost, obviously, and staff retirement. So the legislature actually chartered a study that said, let's figure out what we have, and let's put a plan in action, and let's decide what we're going to do. And it was decided at the high level that the target would be an Oracle technology stack. So they have some kind of licensing there where they kind of get all you can eat Oracle. So it just made sense from a contractual perspective to go to a standard infrastructure, standard architecture, standard database source. But you had to get there. You had to decide what to do there. So some of the facts in this was, they couldn't do that without having an APM study. They recognized have a mid-level manager, APM strategy is not going to fly unless you've got senior level sponsorship. And that's usually where they're feeling the pain of the cost. So many systems were identified as critical and were slated to migrate. Many were retired. We've got 15 applications that were retired. Some of these were DB2, some of these were AS400, some of these are still in the retirement process, right? But the goal was to increase government agility and kind of have a less reliance on legacy skill sets, at the same time promote transparency to the organization. So it's a great example of kind of APM from start to finish. We have another example in the private sector where there were 15 legacy application systems on de-supported hardware that needed to be retired. The issue was that the data sitting on them, which happened to be in a DB2 format, was needed to be retained for legal reasons. And so this turned in from an APM story to an information lifecycle management story. And then the pain is going from a services-oriented approach. How do we take it from a services-oriented approach to more of an automated approach, right? And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So let me give you a couple parting thoughts from my perspective. Is from a best practices perspective, and if you look at the next slide and you talk to Gartner, Dale Vecchio's kind of the champion of a lot of this over there. One of the things you're going to hear them say is it's really the high cost of doing nothing. The longer you wait, the more things entropy is, right? The more things become brittle. The more rare legacy skills are going to be. The more forced marches you're going to be on by a vendor, right? And when you do that, it exposes even more costs. We're seeing a lot of that these days with Sybase, going from 11 and 12 off to 15, right? One of the other important things that we found is start small and scale fast, right? So use the phased approach. Reuse what you have today. And I'm a very big proponent of doing things in a phased approach. You learn, you go through an iteration. It's really a lot like the life cycle development, the waterfall model of life cycle development, right? So if you've not developed a mainframe modernization, a legacy modernization strategy, then you don't have portfolio management in place, now is the time to do that. If you are you're already on your target architecture, Paul as well. I'm running Oracle on Java, or .NET on Oracle, or something else, right? And you're in that modern infrastructure with the APM management and APM lifecycle, meaning you're using tools, you're putting them in a repository, you have a automated method for archiving, active or passive, then that will really keep the entropy abated to your future-proofing your situation, right? So the next question really, usually to me is, all right, now what? What do I do? Okay, I get it. Gartner says it, Forrester says it. I kind of have an idea that I don't know where to start. What do I do? And so that's where we start a discovery process. We recommend, Oracle does these kinds of things where you do a modernization discovery, and it starts with a rationalization. So when you do that rationalization, you can create a roadmap. With that roadmap, you can create your business case. So you can identify, based on the complexities of these systems, how did you know what the complexities were? Well, you had an idea, but you validated it through an APM strategy. You can develop then what your target modern architecture is going to do, and then at the end of the day, you can partner. Typically, there are a handful of experts in the modernization field. We always kind of say, don't try this at home, right? And so we at Oracle will leverage our selected partners that handle legacy modernization. The other thing is, and I'll pass this over to Raghu in just a moment, is how do we get our legacy assets in place in a fashion that's not high cost, on a better architecture, and how can I make it play well nicely with others, right? And that's the idea of active versus passive and things like that. Okay, does that make sense? So the question then is and you can move, we don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this just gives you a feel for kind of the project approach, the project lifestyle. You're going to do your discovery, you're going to make your assessment, you may run a pilot, right? I always joke that everybody everybody in this business is from Missouri, right? I want to see it with their stuff. Show me. And then you go into an implementation. And so very common project approach on anything, but it has to start with discovery. You can't modernize what you don't know, right? So from an application portfolio perspective, right, there's the idea of figuring out what you have, having an infrastructure in place, tools in place to manage that, and then having the ability to make a good decision on the database archiving. What are you going to do for that? And then how are you going to implement application retirement or elimination? And how does that then play with any new applications that you're going to develop moving forward? So I think having said that, this might be a good time for me to pass going from some of the theory of why we're trying to get these things done to Solix on some of the critical tools that we rely on to do homogeneous integration and modernization and archiving.
Thanks, Jason. I think that was great insight into the like what legacy actually means and the challenges that IT enterprises face with the legacy software, and where do we actually start in terms of application portfolio management? I mean, whether it's like identification to ending up with the rationalization and having a macro level view on to get to the portfolio and then to the micro level to actually rationalize the IT assets and minimize the cost. And I think this is where Solix sort of comes into play on providing the application portfolio management aspects for the customers. And Jason talked about a couple of things in the micro level of APM. One is the information lifecycle management for the data itself. And as you have probably heard Jason talking about it, you'll actually find that ILM becomes inherently part of the APM strategy on when and where you want to move the data, and eventually when you want to sunset or retire the application, what do you do with that data? So both active archiving and passive archiving itself. So this is where Solix provides the solution with database archiving for active archiving, so that for the production applications or the modern applications, you can essentially archive the data which is not frequently used, so that you can increase the application performance, lower the storage costs, have compliance so as you manage the data in its life cycle, and also have a better business continuity in terms of backup, red restore, and so forth. And as the data and the application itself ages over the time and it actually becomes a legacy application, then that's where the application retirement or application sunsetting comes into play, where you're talking about passive archiving, where essentially you're taking the entire data set or the partial data set as required from the legacy application and you decommission the application so that you can reduce the maintenance cost but still have the access to the legacy data and obviously compliance with the better management of information lifecycle for the data itself, and also the rationalizing your servers and storage after decommissioning the legacy application. And Jason talked about the quadrant from the Gartner, where we mentioned the time, tolerate, invest, migrate, and eliminate. And if you look at the tolerate, and essentially these might be some of the applications where the enterprises need to keep them running as they have some value in terms of the business processes and so forth. And in the case of invest, essentially you are looking at either modernizing the code, or you're also you need to keep the application running for longer time, and that's where the active archiving also comes into play, and that's where Oracle and Solix can have a combination or a joint solution for in the invest part of the quadrant. And then the migrate is essentially where we are talking about you have a set of legacy applications, and this could be archive the data into the active archive and also retire some or a partial set of the data as required. And the last part is the eliminate, where you are essentially talking about completely decommissioning or turning off the application, but taking the data set of the entire data set from the legacy application and moving it into an archive where you can have the complete data access and data visualization aspect. And to give you an idea of how the sort of a quick end-to-end process works for the application retirement, you can have the applications on several different categories, from mainframe to custom applications to packaged applications, and of course data warehouse applications and so forth. And this is where you actually take the data and the reports from these different categories of applications that need to be decommissioned or retired or sunset, and go through the Solix application retirement product, and essentially you have the capabilities to move the legacy data into one or more data archive platforms based on the service level agreements. You could be moving the data to the Oracle database, where the use case might be a migrate, where you are essentially migrating to a modern application. So the top 40% data set might actually be there for the modern application itself. Or you might be moving the entire data set to Oracle database, which could be acting as a legacy data archive, and that's where Jason mentioned the high-end compression that comes with the Oracle database and so forth. And once the data is actually archived to a legacy archive platform, and the key part there is essentially how do I access the data, my legacy data, and that's where the application portfolio manager and the dashboard sort of comes into the play from Solix, where you can essentially visualize the complete set of applications that you have been working on to retire and so forth, and what kind of retention policies you have on the data, and who can actually view and access the data based on role-based security. And provide a complete ad hoc query and reporting tool for end users so that they can view and access the legacy data itself. Jason talked about one particular APM case study, the state of North Carolina. And I want to talk about one of the large global manufacturer who has sort of going through the APM process, and they're doing the application retirement. And to give you some background, they started off with one single application that was JD Edwards, but they actually saw the returns, and now it has become an enterprise initiative. And I'll talk about the actual numbers or the return on investment in terms of this application retirement, and you see why it became an enterprise initiative. But now they're looking at retiring 50 plus applications across different divisions. And again, the main objectives are reducing the IT costs, which is obvious, and they want, for regulatory compliance reasons, keep the data under retention policies and have a centralized management of all the legacy data that has been that has come from the decommissioned applications. And here we actually used our Solix CDMS application retirement software, and using the Solix application portfolio manager, and we are using the Oracle database here as a data archive platform where it is actually used for all the query and reporting purpose and data visualization aspects. And the projected cost savings for this particular project from this particular customer is about $12 million over 3 years. But let me give you more specific ROI details. And today they have about 551 applications in total, and they want to retire about 53 applications. And if you look at it, it's almost like 10%, or a little. And this 10% is, you can almost take as a number of applications that you typically find in any enterprise that can be sunset what even the analysts like Gartner and all talk about. And based on the ROI they have done, they have realized that the average savings per application is about $19,000, but of course, depending on the type of application, it could be $15,000 or even $40,000 per application. And the result is they have reduced the portfolio of applications to a smaller number, and they're keeping one copy of data for each retired application, reducing the maintenance, licensing, and upgrades. And in the next slide, you would actually see a lot more details on this particular return on investment, on how they have calculated the cost, how much cost they're going to incur, and how much is the savings. And if you look at the interesting part here is the last line item, which is the payback period, which is about 5 months. So if you look at it for number of for the application retirement projects, the payback period of the ROI is like less than a year. So depending on which particular industry you are, some of these projects may not even need budgeting process, go through the budgeting process, for example, in the public sector, because the payback period is less than 1 year. So at this point, I would like to pass it back to Jason for his additional thoughts and comments on the ROI, and then we can also summarize the discussion. Jason, back to you. Jason, is still there? So I think, Jason might join us in a second. So, but to summarize the discussion, essentially, what we have talked here about is the application portfolio management and why it is a key to better manage your IT infrastructure and to identify the applications, to collect the data and analyze these applications, and eventually rationalize the applications so that you can essentially reduce the cost or the total cost of ownership for these legacy applications. And we also talked about the different reasons on why we need to embark on application portfolio management strategy, and one of the key issues like the reduction of the skilled IT staff for particular set of applications, and of course the second is the value that the applications themselves are bringing, even if you maintain them by just keeping them running. So in many cases, these applications are no longer bringing any value or adding value to the business processes in the enterprise, and that's where you need to take a look at it and see which of these have to be retired or sunset. Jason, is that you?
Yes.
Right. So I was just summarizing the discussion here, so maybe we can get some thoughts from you on a couple of things. One is the ROI. I talked a little bit about the ROI itself, and it would be good if you can hear some of your thoughts and based on your experience, you have been working with several customers as well, and also summarize the discussion.
Great. So that was like 3 questions. So are you asking first kind of what my experience has been with ROI, with APM and archiving?
Yeah, I think that would be the first one. If you can touch on that and give your perspective on the ROI itself.
Sure. So, the ROI measurement is very dependent upon what you're coming from, of course, right? So it's very difficult to say here's an average, but it can be measured in several different ways. From a hardware cost and things like that savings, it can be done 10 to 20% savings in that. From an APM strategy, I've found that costs can be saved, maintenance costs in many situations because of having a properly rationalized portfolio and you're working correctly on the right things is an improvement of efficiency by 20% or more. So it's very, like I said, it's very difficult to say, well, you're definitely going to save 40% of your infrastructure. I mean, you can for sure, coming off of a legacy platform, but kind of a good thumbnail number that you know you can get at with a proper managed portfolio, taking advantage of archived information and probably accessing it and having a more efficient maintenance cycle can range between 10 to 30%. I mean, that's my take. But again, it depends on what area you're really talking about.
All right. Okay, thank you, Jason, on the particular insight.
Now, so was the last question kind of summarizing what we've discussed, or what? I think you had 2 or 3, and I just want to make sure I cover them all.
Yeah, so I think the next one is like if you can summarize the discussion and so that we can take away like the top 3 or 5 points on this particular APM topic.
Sure. So obviously, legacy costs and a desire for an organization to have a better TCO is true everywhere. It's not just commercial, financial, and manufacturing. It's everywhere, right? And so with the increased retirement of business knowledgeable people and skill sets, plus the economy that we're facing right now has generally made a proper archival strategy, information lifecycle strategy more critical. I think the takeaway is that you can't modernize what you don't know, and a phased approach is absolutely key to moving things forward, right? And so all these approaches leverage reuse, because that's what we're really about in modernization is reusing the assets. So when you talk about archival, when you talk about active archival, when you talk about integration, you need to leverage what you've already invested in. And so hopefully what you've been able to see today is that choosing that target architecture is important, and how you get there is even more important. And that's really what Solex and Oracle together are able to achieve for our customers. Whether you're looking at a cost savings of 9 to 12% in data access to upwards of 30 and 40% from a hardware refresh, you have options.
Thanks, Jason.
Sure. Again, thanks for working through the technical difficulties. I've tried to be a little bit mobile here so I can get to less constructive spots. I think our office was upgrading networking today.
Okay.
Apologies.
So for the people on the call, you can send the questions on the chat line. But Jason, I have one question on the chat line. The question, are there any particular industries or any particular vertical industries that are more prone for this legacy retirement, or is it across the industries?
I think it tends to be often, if I would obviously say, financial services and public sector are definitely candidates for these systems. They've been around for a very, very long time, and they tended to need and require IT. So that I say just off the top. That's where I'm very busy, right? And that's where you're very busy. However, if you've been in manufacturing or if you've been in transportation, if you've been in production for any extended period of time, then you're going to have a legacy platform. It's almost better to measure it by what's your revenue stream. I've found that the larger the revenue stream of the corporation, the more likely that they have a very large legacy footprint. Because it's harder to change, it's harder to do, it's been around for a longer time. Does that make sense? I mean, would you have anything to add to that from your experience, I guess?
Yeah, I think definitely at the public sector side, I think we have seen talking to the number of officials and all, and it seems there are particular targeted projects in the federal government where they are trying to look at reducing the number of the data centers from 1,400 down to about 800 or so. So again, that is again a rationalization of the IT infrastructure, which means like not only the hardware part, but essentially rationalizing the application infrastructure, which could be databases, applications, and obviously there will be a number of applications that will be the prime candidates for retirement and so forth. So any other questions on the for the people on the phone at this point? All right. So if not any other questions, we will wrap the session at this point of time. And then, Jason, we really appreciate you taking your time and joining us for this particular session. And if anyone has any questions, you'll be able to reach us through our email.
Wonderful.